All right, the next country that we're going to look at this semester is Russia. Like we have with the UK, and we will with every other country, we'll break Russia down into three or four different conceptual pieces. The first one being kind of what makes Russia uh, Russia. What historically do we need to know about Russia and the former Soviet Union to kind of understand why Russia is the way it is today? If we want to talk about why studying Russia is important, we can isolate four reasons. First, it gives us a really good understanding of kind of a history of how communism gets applied, and this will help us kind of understand a litany of issues when we get to talking about the formation of the Communist Party in China, because China also adopts elements of the playbook of the USSR in establishing their system. We also get to look at kind of the rise and fall of totalitarianism, and then maybe a reemergence of a totalitarian leaning authoritarian system under kind of the current vestiges of government. Second, it allows us to look at an evolutionary democracy that while Russia is probably more of an illiberal democracy than a liberal democracy, we can pinpoint some crucial events in looking at what leads to Russia becoming more democratic than it necessarily was when it was part of the USSR. Um, and like I said, we can look at what allows a democratically elected leader to become a little bit more authoritarian. If we want to talk about Russia in a geographic sense, Russia's official name is the Russian Federation. It's the largest successor state of the Soviet Union, that everything else that were kind of the outlying republics or other nations kind of broke away from, uh, Russian control at the, end of the 80s, early 90s. This becomes geographically the largest nation state to survive. In terms of size, it's the largest geographic country in the world at 17 million and change square miles, and it spans 11 time zones. And one of the things we can talk about is whether or not size can create some issues, whether or not size and relative population density can create some issues, and we'll kind of look at the unique challenges that Russia faces, kind of being across, a spectrum of climates, geographic regions, and things like that. They do have the largest European population, or they're the largest European country in terms of their population at about 140 million. That there was a steady population decline from the fall of the Soviet Union, from the late 80s, early 90s up until about 2009. And we've seen kind of a trend in repopulation, that their birth rate is going up, their death rate is kind of leveling off at a normal age rate. So their population is slowly increasing, and it's a question of whether or not that trend will continue. If we want to talk about a rural-urban divide, 73% of that population lives in urban areas, primarily in Western Russia, and we'll talk about those kinds of issues when we look at towards the last set of notes when we talk about citizen society in the state. This video is a kind of good crash course in Russian history. Just like the rest of the countries that we talk about, they have kind of a rich, valuable history that's worth kind of diving into, especially if your understanding of Russian history is kind of the role they've played around the world wars, the Cold War, and today. That this kind of takes you through the rise and fall of the Russian Empire. It'll take up about 10 minutes of your time, but I think it's a very good, fairly accurate look at kind of their history that helps you understand the background leading in to the Russian Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution. That's where we're going to start historically, because it kind of lays the strongest foothold for what goes down in contemporary Russia. So when we talk about the Bolshevik Revolution, the goal was, a class-based uprising, and where Russia can kind of mark its stamp historically is that they're the first country to base a political system on, the teachings of Karl Marx. It all comes from the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution that's led by Lenin, and the goal was to create kind of a populist uprising where the working class, the agrarian class, overthrew the czarist government, kind of the monarch, the long history of kind of emperors and a small number of families running Russia. There will be a video at the end of this section that will kind of give you a good crash course in the Russian Revolution if you're not familiar with some of those goings on, if you didn't take Euro with Mr. Schumann, for example, or your world history teacher kind of skimmed over the Russian Revolution. But the ideological basis of the Bolshevik Revolution is VII Lenin's interpretation of Marx's Communist Manifesto, and we'll kind of look a little bit about Marx's arguments, and then we'll talk about how Lenin and people who follow in Lenin's footsteps kind of appropriate elements of Marxism to what they need to happen or what they think needs to happen in Russia, and we'll kind of highlight some differences as well. When we talk about vanguardism in terms of kind of the rise of this communist ideology, what really happens is you have a handful of pot stirrers, a handful of revolutionary leaders who really kind of provoke this revolution in Russia, and the Communist Party becomes a vanguard party. And what that means is that it's a party that operates in the true interests of whatever group that it represents. That even if there's not a correspondence of understanding between the expressed interest and maybe what the group is doing or how the group is operating, they still kind of operate under the claim that they are the best voice of the people or a particular, subset or subpopulation of the people. The second thing that you need to know about kind of the base ideology under the Bolshevik Revolution is that they believed in democratic centralism, where there is a hierarchical party structure. So there's a clear head of the party, there's a clear rank and file, and there are clear kind of underlings, where the leaders are elected from below. But there's kind of a mass line in implementing the decisions of the party once they're made. It's kind of like when we talked about the notion of collective responsibility in the UK or in just about any parliamentary system where people fall in line with the prime minister, that the government, the majority party needs to appear like they're all on the same page. That kind of becomes the goal of the Marxist philosophy kind of pushed for under Lenin's interpretation of communism. That there shouldn't be dissent, that if people are disagreeing when decisions are being made, once a decision is made, everybody needs to appear like they're on the same page. So those are kind of the base level things you need to know about Lenin's kind of approach to a structure after the revolution. This video that I would like you to watch is one of those 8-bit philosophy videos where they kind of describe Marxism. If you remember our discussion of Hegel and the dialectic to kind of explore the end of history, Marx utilizes a dialectic to make the argument as to why communism is kind of the end of history in terms of an economic system, and that he uses what's called dialectical materialism to kind of justify the arguments for why his philosophy creates the best kind of endpoint. So for a more richer understanding of how the philosophy of Marx gets appropriated by the Bolshevik Revolution and by further communist leaders in Russia. I really think it would be good for you to watch this video, and then we'll kind of talk about a discussion question in the next slide. Okay, so hopefully you watched the Marxism video, because you need to understand Marx's argument about how, we progress from capitalism into kind of communism as a system. And he thinks revolution is inevitable. That eventually workers would become disaffected with their standing, that they would not feel a connection to their means of production, that you would inevitably have a socialist revolution to create this endpoint of history that's classless and stateless. So the question becomes, what happens? Why is Lenin different from Marx? And the answer is kind of simple. Russia was not very well developed at the point in time when Lenin kind of appropriated Marx's arguments for a revolution. That it was poorly developed. They were a largely kind of feudal country without an industrial working class. And this kind of appropriation of Marx would be a denial of the Marxist views of history, right? Because if you want to create a post-capitalist society, then people need to understand the exploitation that came alongside working in a factory, right? Becoming disaffected with capital, that kind of stuff. So you also need people who can be kind of organic revolutionary leaders calling to overthrow that specific system. And Lenin thought that you could manufacture this Bolshevik uprising, that you could have a strong leader from the starting point kind of riling people up to overthrow the system, and then create kind of the means for an overthrow. And really, this is why Marxists would say that communist Russia is not a good example of whether or not communism works, because it just jumps over the step of kind of having the citizenry be able to kind of critique and overcome capitalism. So know that he is using Marxism, but Marx would not agree with Lenin's interpretation of Marxist theory. So once the Bolshevik Revolution is kind of complete, and Lenin kind of ascends to power, he then made the argument that economic production, industrialization, agricultural development needs to happen from a central government, right? That you need someone to control the means of production and the means of distribution, which is something that Marx would agree with, even though people's criticism of the Russian Revolution is that they weren't ready for Marx's transition. So in 1922, the USSR is completed, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they became a little bit more authoritarian than the notion of democratic centrism kind of led on to at the beginning. That the authoritarianism that played its way out during the kind of prominence or the reign of the USSR eliminates kind of the democratic promise or hope that socialists point to in the system, that, right, the people get to appoint the leader and then things are top down, that the leaders kind of became a little too corrupt with power in the eyes of many historically, and that's why this system may have turned out badly in terms of what some people wanted. Any kind of competing ideology was banned, that anything that you were doing not in the name of state kind of was deemed a threat to the security of the state. So this is when you see kind of Russia become a bit more isolationist, a bit more kind of focusing on developing themselves, which also leads to some eventual struggle. In 1929, Stalin takes control, and Stalin is really the person who kind of, blurs the line between party and the government, and makes the party kind of be in charge of everything. And this is where you see, the birth of a political one-party system, because no other political parties were allowed to compete. So it all becomes, if you want to, jockey for a powerful position, that you need to make yourself look good so you can be recruited into the throes of power. That they use a system that's referred to as nomenklatura, which is lower members of the party being selected from higher members of the party by showing that they are dedicated to the party, showing that they are competent enough to lead. Elements that we do see in democratic systems, right? When parties kind of recruit individuals that they think could run for election or win a position. But this is all happening within the auspices of the party in Russia. You see the birth of the Central Committee, which is the organization that kind of governs the party, and it's led by the Politburo, which is a structure of like 15 of the most powerful individuals in Russia, that these are the party elites, that these are the ones who are making all of the policy that then gets implemented by the Central Committee, and then the General Secretary is the head of the Politburo and functionally becomes the leader of the country, and will play with the role of like a General Secretary, a Politburo, and all of those elements a little bit more in depth, because these structures were used and are still used to govern the People's Republic of China. The next thing that kind of happens under Stalin's reign of control is that you see a big push for collectivization, that by 1935, about 6 years into Stalin's control, 90% of land that was owned by peasants prior to Stalin were taken by the state and turned into collective farms. And the argument was that the people needed to lose land, that the government needed to control land and control the production to stop the emergence of a new capitalist class. Ownership of private land was abolished, and the problem with this became that the government didn't know how to manage the land, or they set forth, agrarian production targets that were not feasible, and this leads to a lot of death and famine, because either people lose the will to produce, or government mismanagement of the land makes it impossible to kind of produce at a level necessary to sustain the population. Industrialization also happens, where you see a big push for heavy industry. This is where you see the birth of kind of the 5-year development plan as to what the state believes they need to focus on to increase the prominence of the state. So you started seeing kind of heavy industry focused on, oil, steel, and electricity, but not so much any other consumer good, which leaves Russia kind of open to problems with a lack of economic diversification, which we'll talk about several times throughout, kind of the policy portion of this lecture, where we can talk about why a narrow focus on the kinds of things your economy can produce is probably a bad plan for you. During Stalin's reign, this is where it becomes infinitely more totalitarian than kind of the birth of the revolution. That Stalin became the new person who was in charge of everything, that if you disagreed with Stalin, you were probably labeled treasonous and executed, or you kind of disappeared to Siberia, into some of these work camps or prisons, that some of them still very much exist today. that you saw media censorship, that you saw state control of the arts, that everything was done in the name of kind of glorifying the state, and that the only point of capital T truth would be information that comes downhill from the party, from Stalin himself to the people. These, people who were labeled as kind of dissenters, threats, or enemies of the states were purged, and that it's estimated that during Stalin's reign, 5% of the population, which is millions of people, were disappeared or executed for treason. Eventually, you see an attempt at what's called de-Stalinization, which you see kind of a battle between two leaders in Khrushchev and Brezhnev, where Nikita Khrushchev leads a process of reform the goal of upholding the communist dream, the strong central state, was still the end point, but he wanted to get rid of terror as a political control, right? That if the people are living in fear, people aren't going to be productive. If people are, people need to be able to dissent because it might spark some good ideas, and people need to feel like they have fidelity to the desires of the party or the wishes of the leader, and not like they're acting constantly in terms of terror. Some of these reforms didn't work, and they ended when a new leader kind of ascends to power, Leonid Brezhnev, who we won't talk about very much because it's the following leader who I think is more important. Mikhail Gorbachev runs the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991, and I think he is probably the most important person to understand of what creates the transition between the Soviet Union and the creation of the Russian state, and why he kind of indirectly creates the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was a reformer who wanted to allow communism to adapt to kind of global changes around it, not usher in its demise. So there were three goals that he wanted to focus on. First is glasnost, which is the notion of political openness. That he kind of agreed with Khrushchev in principle that locking up dissent is a bad thing. That people should be able to voice their policies. They should be able to ask questions of the government so they can understand why things are happening. So glasnost leads to more open political discussion, which a byproduct of that is revolt, right? If people aren't going to be persecuted for views antithetical to that of the state, then people might be willing to kind of come together and collectively uprise, which happens in some of the outlying socialist republics, and you see revolution. Second, he stood for believing that democratization is a good thing, right? Back to some of those old notions of democratic centralism, that the people should have a say in who their leader is, even if the leader then is the one responsible for making the rest of the decisions. So he creates the Congress of People's Deputies, which would then select a president to run, which, again, it's hard to kind of keep this notion of a mass line if people will have the opportunity to elect individuals that may be pot stirrers. The last is perestroika. Perestroika was Gorbachev's market reform, that he wanted to slowly start privatizing things, that he wanted to still have elements of command systems, but he wanted to kind of have a market economy in the name of growth. These all lead to an eventual attempt to remove Gorbachev through a coup, that you saw a lot of conservatives, a lot of traditional, hardline state-centric communists who did not want to see a system overthrown. And while there was a coup, and in that attempt to overthrow Gorbachev, that there was a kind of counter coup where there were more protesters who were in favor of someone who was infinitely more radical than Gorbachev was, and this is where you see Boris Yeltsin, the person who is elected the president of Russia. And when Gorbachev is restored to power, already 11 republics declared their independence, which functionally led to the end of the Soviet Union. So as a result of the coup, like the Soviet Union collapses, that Yeltsin is elected to be the president of the Russian Federation. And here's kind of a little video that breaks down the 91 coup, that shows kind of the protests and counter-protests to the coup and the counter-coup. And it talks a little bit about kind of the restoration of order by Gorbachev and then Yeltsin being pushed into power. Yeltsin wanted to create a Western-style democracy that he wanted to kind of evolve and adapt with the times. So this leads to him pushing for the Constitution of 1993 that had 3 branches of government. It had an executive branch which had both a president and a prime minister, and we'll talk about those 2 roles a little bit more when we look at the institutions notes. There were legislatures. There was a legislative house known as the Duma, which still exists today, and then the establishment of a constitutional court. The other thing that he wanted to have is an economic principle known as shock therapy. Shock therapy is kind of radical market reform that eliminated a large portion of any remaining kind of vestiges of state corporatism. So you saw price and wage controls lifted. You saw a series of privatization vouchers given to Russians in November of 1992 to invest in companies, and it tried to create insider privatization, right? That these entities that were owned by the state would now be owned by, a private individual invested in it by the workers. But shock therapy kind of failed for a couple of reasons. First, inflation shot through the roof in 1992. The inflation rate was at 1,354%. You saw kind of a huge blip in their GDP, that there was a huge decline in agricultural and industrial production. You saw a large degree of capital flight, that people wanted to start investing in firms outside of the country since a lot of those controls were lifted. And then you saw money laundering. You saw the revitalization of, the scary Russian mafia. And then the end point of this was the rise of the oligarchs, that there were individuals who, amassed wealth during the period of time of the USSR, and when all of these things are kind of forcibly gone public, these individuals were the ones who are now able to buy everything and profit off of, a massive switch to privatization. The oligarchs became the new elite class that owned, the natural resources, everything owned by the state and the media, that eventually led to, Yeltsin being guaranteed a second term, that guaranteed Putin's ascent into power, because these are the people with kind of all of the money. Yeltsin had to resign before the 2000 presidential election. Part of it was because he was ill, part of it was because he was a huge drunk, and when Russians, who kind of take a bad rap for having a trend towards alcoholism, when Russians are calling their leader an alcoholic, things are probably kind of bad. And then his behavior just became a lot more erratic. So Putin, who had been appointed his prime minister, becomes the acting president when he steps down. In 2000, Putin is elected. He serves 2 4-year terms, which honored the constitutional limit. But in 2008, Dmitry Medvedev, who was Putin's prime minister, gets elected. That he runs for only 1 term. You start to see a shift of the power to the prime minister, who was Putin at the time. And then in 2012, Putin claims that he gets to run again as part of a kind of a loophole that exists, that there were reforms that changed from 4-year terms to 6-year terms. So in 2012, Putin was reelected. We'll talk about Putin a little bit more in the institutions lecture. But, right, the rise of Putin kind of creates Russia to be this, radically unpredictable entity that it's kind of become today. And this is before, right, Putin and Russia become topics that everybody has become a little bit more concerned about, with questions about what role Russia might have played in our presidential election. The last thing that you should watch, this is an epic rap battle of history video that if you're turned off by some colorful language, maybe this video isn't for you, but it starts off as a rap battle between Rasputin and Stalin, and then you see a few other individuals who played prominent roles in the historical period that we just talked about kind of show up. So I think this is a good way to wrap up all things Russia and all things that led to the contemporary Russian state.